Okay, so now the very important concept, which is the role of inflammation. Okay, so there is a new term in research which is called as diabesity. So what is diabesity? It is diabetes plus obesity. Okay, so previously, very early on in very old eras, okay, not exactly in the Stone Age, but you get the picture. All right, so anti-inflammatory medicines like aspirin, they were used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Obviously, but aspirin is not the ideal treatment for type 2 diabetes. You keep taking it regularly, it will have its own side effects. So this was stopped. But basically, the main finding over here is that anti-inflammatory medicines were used in type 2 diabetes, and this resulted in regulation of blood sugar levels. So something anti-inflammatory is the main clue over here. So yes, research then started focusing on what is the role of inflammation in these two major chronic health disease conditions which has infested the world, which is diabetes and obesity. So we are going to understand the role of inflammation. All right, so yes, one more previously what was thought, which was wrong, was that fat are dormant cells, meaning the only function of fat cell is to store fat in the body. It does not do anything else. But now we know that is absolutely wrong, because fat cells, they have the ability to produce their own hormones like adipocytokines. And we studied about adipocytokines in your week 1 lecture, in the obesity lecture. So if you don't remember, go back to that. All right. And yes, when you have these adipocytokines, some sort of adipocytokines, they can act as inflammatory agents. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to say is we need to understand the role of inflammation in causing insulin resistance. Okay. So before you understand the role of inflammation in diabetes and obesity, it is very important to understand the basics of your immune system. Okay, so you have, I'll just hover my mouse over it. You have lymphocytes. Okay, so what are lymphocytes? They are immunomodulatory agents. All right, so what do I mean by modulatory agents? They have the ability to produce certain type of cells. Okay, what are these type of cells that the lymphocytes can produce? You have T cells and you have B cells. T cells, they produce certain types of cytokines, interleukin and tumor necrosis factor. Interleukin 1 and 6 is the most important one, which we are going to be focusing on as part of nutrition and disease curriculum. All right, and tumor necrosis factor. These two are of our interest. There are different types of cytokines which are produced in the body, different functions. Majority of the research in the area of diabetes and obesity are focusing on these two cytokines, tumor necrosis factor, interleukin. Therefore, we'll be focusing on those. And then you have B cells. Your B cells produce antibodies. Okay. Then you have the other thing which you have in your immune system is your monocytes. Okay. Basically, I call them as eaters is because monocytes, basically they eat pathogens, they eat harmful bacteria. Basically, their way of protecting the body is by eating the bad guys. Okay, so that's your monocytes. And when they eat something, they are called as macrophages. Okay. Then you have neutrophils. Neutrophils is your first line of defense. So when you have any bacteria, virus, pathogen entering your body, neutrophils are the first one to get activated. They will tell the lymphocyte something is happening, some foreign element is there. So start activating the immune system. And that is when lymphocytes will release the T cells, B cells, depending upon what is required in the body. All right. Then you have the basophils or eosinophils. They are parasite fighting. Okay. So they will be fighting the parasite. The key ones which are most important for your unit nutrition and disease, which we are going to be focusing on, is your lymphocytes, your monocytes. Okay. These are the two main important things in the context of nutrition and disease. All right. So moving forward. So yes, there are basically the biggest theory over here is that when you have high inflammation rate in the body, okay, so you have high inflammatory agents in the body, this results in high insulin resistance, and insulin resistance can cause obesity. How does it do all that is what we are going to be studying. Basically, guys, your unit nutrition and disease is lots about understanding the pathophysiological mechanisms. And there are various hypothesized pathophysiological mechanism for you to just bear in mind. The ones which I am teaching you as part of this unit, which you're covering, are the pathophysiological mechanisms which have been extensively studied, extensively researched. Those most common pathways or mechanisms is what I'm teaching you. There are various other which are postulated hypothesized mechanism, but because they are still in the hypothesis stage, they are not being taught to you. So to keep it simple, the mechanisms which you will be learning and nutrition and disease, this unit is all about understanding the pathophysiological mechanisms. So the mechanisms which you will be learning, they are the one which are most extensively researched. If you come across something else in the literature, it is not wrong. It's just that this was most extensively researched and therefore it's being taught to you, all right, as part of the curriculum. But of course, if you had to do research in this space, you would be looking at all sorts of mechanisms. All right, so I hope this is clear. So basically over here, the conclusion is that, as I said, some sort of inflammation in the body, chronic inflammation, can result in insulin resistance and obesity. Okay, so guys, this is just an FYI. As I said that, you know, your, if you go ahead over here, you have your lymphocytes. Okay, so lymphocytes produce T cells, which I said. Okay, so yes, your lymphocytes, remember that slide, lymphocytes produce T cells, and the two most common sort of inflammatory substances which are produced by T cells are the one which we are going to be focusing on as part of your curriculum, which is interleukin, okay, 1 and 6, and tumor necrosis factor. All right, so there are many other inflammatory substances. The most common one which you will see in repeated lectures is interleukin and tumor necrosis factor. So yes, your T cells do produce inflammatory substance, and these are two of the many more which are there. Okay. So now, basically, this slide is to tell you that these are the various types of conditions in the body which are inflammatory conditions. All right, and these are chronic inflammatory conditions. When I say chronic, it means long term. Okay, for example, diabetes. If an individual has diabetes, we know there is no cure for diabetes. You can only manage diabetes. Diabetes is a chronic inflammatory condition. Okay, meaning it's a long-term condition. All right. Similarly, chronic hepatitis, chronic pancreatitis, chronic kidney disease, CKD, rheumatoid arthritis, gastritis. If you see any of these TIS, when you have TIS added to it, TIS means inflammation in medical terminology. That is what it refers to. Okay. So these are all chronic inflammatory conditions. And if you see, obesity is also a chronic inflammatory condition. Okay, very important. So basically, why is obesity a chronic inflammatory condition? Because obesity is still a new phenomena in terms of human evolution. All right. So we were not born to be fat. Okay. Or when we were born, we were not fat. Okay. So human beings being obese is still a new phenomena from an evolutionary point of view. Your body is still not adapted to the concept of being fat. And now I'm using very colloquial terms just so that it becomes easier for you to grasp the concept. Okay. So yes, we were not meant to be fat. All right. But now in the last 50 years, we have seen that obesity is an epidemic condition. Okay. Like we have seen epigenetics in the last lecture, and how 90% of the population is at the risk of obesity because of underlying genetic conditions. All right. So this is what I'm saying, that obesity is considered as a chronic inflammatory condition. Okay, by the body. If the body is obese, you have a sublime level of inflammation going on. Okay, now there are two mechanisms which will answer the question, which is here. That is, how does obesity cause inflammation, induce insulin resistance? Meaning, how does obesity cause diabetes in simple terms? Okay. So first we are going to look at how obesity is causing diabetes, and there are two mechanisms to it. When I say, guys, there are two mechanisms to it, it is very important to understand that it is not that one mechanism is going on in the body, that finishes, then the second mechanism is going on. No, this is actually interlinked. This is going on simultaneously. Just to teach you, I have separated this into two mechanisms. In your body, it is not number one going on and number two going on. This is going on as a whole unit. Okay. So hope that makes sense. So now going to the main mechanisms. So the first mechanism of how obesity causes type 2 diabetes. All right. So yes, when you have an individual who is obese, as I said, obesity is an underlying condition of chronic inflammation. Okay, so you have sublime inflammation going on. Now you have to connect these dots to your lecture one. As I said, in nutrition and disease, you have all of these lectures which are interconnected. Okay, so when you write your responses, you have to think of this kind of explanation which I'm saying. You see, a lot less is written on my slide and a lot is which I say, because it's all over here. It's difficult to write all of those points on the slides. It's practically impossible. The slide will become too wordy, okay, and it will be difficult to understand. That's why when you write your responses in your exams, for instance, you have to connect these dots. Obesity, this is a condition of chronic inflammation. All right. When I say it's a condition of chronic inflammation, if you look at your lecture one and you had the slide on epigenetics, your epigenetics slide indicated and clearly stated that when you have obesity, which is a condition of sublime inflammation, you have impaired gene expression, meaning you have, say, mutated or you have malformation of your DNA, RNA nucleus. Okay, your main, say your main genetic bodies. Okay, so you have impaired gene expression. All right. Now, when you have impaired gene expression, the macrophages which are produced by an obese individual in comparison to an individual of healthy weight, all right, those macrophages are also impaired. Firstly, if you see over here, high number of macrophages present in the fat cells. Okay. So yes, there are more number of macrophages which are present in the fat cells of an obese individual. And furthermore, these macrophages are genetically impaired. Okay. Why are they genetically impaired? Because obesity is a condition of sublime inflammation. When you have chronic inflammation going on in your body, this will impair gene expression. All right. And impaired gene expression, meaning impaired immune system. When you have an impaired immune system, you have impaired macrophages which are produced. Does this all make sense? All these connections. Okay. Then what happens? I'll go very slowly through these mechanisms because your entire lecture is filled with mechanisms. So now we know in an obese individual, okay, so this is speaking from a generic point of view. Okay, it's not that every obese individual, but from a generic point of view, what the theory postulates is that in an obese individual, yes, you have increased number of macrophages and they are genetically impaired. All right, so that's these 2 points which I said. Increased number of macrophages, yes, they are genetically impaired. Then what happens? These genetically impaired macrophages, which are higher in number, they will release inflammatory products such as cytokines. Okay, so yes, you have these macrophages which will release cytokines, or even there is another thing. Again, as I said, it's not written in the slide. These are the things you have to make connections of. When you have greater number of macrophages in the body, your lymphocyte system gets activated. Okay, your lymphocyte system says, why are there so many macrophages in the body, in the fat cells? There surely must be something which is going wrong. Let me directly release those T cells, and those T cells will then release inflammatory substances. Okay. So yes, you have macrophages which are genetically impaired. Because they are genetically impaired, they release inflammatory products such as cytokines, and then directly your immune system is also activated, which is your lymphocytes. All right. And your lymphocytes then will start producing greater number of T cells, which is a direct source of producing inflammatory substances such as cytokines. Okay. So basically what is happening, you have lots of cytokines, and these cytokines, as you know, are inflammatory substances, and the key types of cytokines which are produced are your interleukin 1 and 6 and your tumor necrosis factor. Okay. So yes, now when you have lots of inflammation in the body, which is inflammatory substances such as tumor necrosis factors, cytokines, this leads to insulin resistance. Now, what do I mean by insulin resistance? Now you know, it is the poor complex between the insulin receptor and insulin. Okay, so the complex is not being formed because of inflammation. All right, and obviously you know that in an obese individual there is greater amount of visceral fat. Visceral fat will also mechanically prevent the complex being formed between the insulin receptor and the insulin. Okay, and similarly, because of inflammation, you again have this weak complex between the insulin receptor and insulin, and therefore you have high insulin resistance. And thus, when you have high insulin resistance, you have poor transportation of glucose from the blood into the cell. Therefore, you have high blood sugar levels, which is an indicator of type 2 diabetes. Does that make sense, guys? So in summary, in an obese individual, you have impaired genetic expression. When you have impaired genetic expression, it leads to macrophages, which are greater in number, and these macrophages have the ability of producing its own inflammatory substances, cytokines. This will also, on the other hand, activate your lymphocytes, activate T cells, T cells producing cytokines. Therefore, overall, what is the net results? You have increased inflammatory substances, cytokines, which are your tumor necrosis factor, interleukin 1 and 6. And all of this then leads to insulin resistance, and insulin resistance meaning causing type 2 diabetes. Okay. So this is your mechanism 1. All right. So now moving on to your mechanism 2. Now if you see over here, guys, this blue thing is there on both of these slides, mechanism 1, and you have this blue box. You have mechanism 2 and you have this blue box, just to show you that how these two mechanisms at this stage where you have the blue color, they unite and they do the same thing, which is increase insulin resistance and therefore type 2 diabetes. Okay, so that is where both of these mechanisms, they amalgamate together. Okay, right now they are bifurcated into these two streams. Okay, so now the second mechanism says that in an obese individual, again this follows from your obesity lecture, you have hypertrophy. And if you remember what hypertrophy is, it is increase in fat mass. Okay, so the size of the fat cell. So yes, you have big fat cells, large size fat cells. When the surface area or the size of the fat cell increases, the need of that cell also increases, meaning the oxygen requirement, nutrient requirement of those big fat cells also increase. But on the other hand, what is happening? You have less oxygen, less nutrients, which are being transported or provided to these big fat cells. All right. And remember, in an obese individual, it is highly likely that they already have hyperplasia and now they are having hypertrophy. Okay. So then what happens? Why do you have less amount of oxygen nutrient being transported to that fat cells? Because of less oxygen RBC saturation. You know, your RBC is the main thing. Okay, your hemoglobin is the main thing which is carrying that oxygen to all parts of your body, right? So you have less oxygen saturation of the RBC. Okay, and why is this so? This is because, why do you have less oxygen saturation? Because you have a low resting metabolic rate. Why may you have a low resting metabolic rate? Again, you have to go back to your obesity lecture. You have to go back to your autonomous nervous system. And in your autonomous nervous system, I spoke about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All right. So when your autonomous nervous system functioning is impaired, it could be secondary to a metabolic condition such as hypothyroidism, or it could be because obesity is a sublime condition which has overall impaired your resting metabolic rate and your metabolism. And therefore, you have less oxygen saturation capacity of the RBC, of the hemoglobin. Okay. So now, what happens to an individual whose oxygen supply is cut off? They die. All right. The same thing happens to the cell. Okay. When you have less oxygen, less nutrients which are reaching the cell, the hypertrophic cell, the cells start dying. Okay. The death of cell is called as necrosis. Okay. In medical terms. So yes, you have necrosis of the cell happening when you have lot of dead bodies, okay, which is necrosis of the cell. then what happens? This will trigger your immune system, because anything which is dead in your body, dead cells, etc., that needs to be cleared off. Okay. So when you have necrosis of the cell happening, your immune system is the one who can clear it off. So yes, your immune system is triggered. When your immune system is triggered, meaning your monocytes are triggered, your monocytes within the fat cells. So now these monocytes, they start eating all of these dead cells. They become into macrophages. Okay. Now you remember the first function. These macrophages, remember, they are more in number, and these macrophages are genetically impaired, meaning they will release a lot more of inflammatory products such as the cytokines. Okay. And as I told you, on the other hand, when your immune system is activated, your leukocytes, they automatically will produce a lot of T cells because of obesity as it is. Okay. And T cells meaning cytokines, cytokines meaning interleukin-1, 6 tumor necrosis factor. Okay, yes, so you have a lot of inflammation. Lot of inflammation meaning high insulin resistance, less insulin sensitivity, which therefore results in type 2 diabetes. Okay, so yes, over here the second mechanism talks about morphology of the fat cells. Okay, meaning you have hypertrophy and you have less oxygen nutrient reaching that, and because of which necrosis, because of necrosis, you have triggering of the immune system, macrophages and T cells, therefore resulting in inflammation, inflammation resulting in insulin resistance, and therefore type 2 diabetes. Okay. So these are the most two commonly researched mechanisms in the literature which we have covered. There are many, many more, but yes, I won't go over all of those. Otherwise, you will faint. Okay, so let's just keep to the two most commonly researched mechanisms. Okay, so basically, guys, this is how obesity can result in type 2 diabetes. And this is how, when generically you must have heard people saying that you should have a watch over your weight because then you are at risk of type 2 diabetes. You now know exactly how this happens. Okay. So now the question has changed. What's the question? How can insulin resistance cause obesity? Okay. Meaning when you have a diabetic individual, all right, type 2 diabetes, this can result in obesity. Okay. So insulin resistance can again trigger inflammation, and this inflammation can further result in obesity. Okay, so diabetic individual at risk of obesity is what we are talking about. Now, this mechanism is a bit more longer. I could not fit it in the Word document. Sorry, in the PowerPoint, and therefore I'm sharing it as a Word document. So let me just share it with you. So I'll share the Word document now. Share Word document. Yes, I hope you can see this. So rest assured, all of this is available on your canvas. Okay. So now we'll go over this. You have high insulin resistance. Okay. You have high insulin resistance. So this is because the individual is diabetic. Okay. So now the question is opposite. You have a diabetic individual. In a diabetic individual, obviously you have high insulin resistance. Okay. When you have high insulin resistance, what does this mean? It means the glucose levels in your blood are high. Okay. High blood sugar level. All right. Hyperglycemia. Okay. So yes, you have high insulin resistance. Because of high insulin resistance, you have hyperglycemia, high blood sugar level. So now what happens? Obviously, when you have lots of glucose in your blood, some amount of glucose will definitely be used for energy production inside the cell. So in a diabetic individual, as you know, naturally a type 2 diabetic individual has the capacity of secreting some amount of insulin. The amount of insulin is not sufficient to a level of a healthy individual, but there is some amount of insulin secretion. So yes, in a diabetic individual, you have some amount of insulin secretion. This some amount of insulin secretion will help the diabetic individual to take some glucose from the blood, take it into the cell. When the glucose is in the cell, that is when you have energy production, which is your glycolysis cycle first, and then your TCA cycle. Okay. This will generate your normal glucose being taken up for energy. However, as I said, the insulin is not sufficient in a diabetic individual. So you have large amount of glucose which are still floating in the blood, because of insulin resistance. Okay, so yes, you have large amount of glucose in the blood because of insulin resistance. Now when you have these free molecules of glucose which are floating in the blood, this is what happens. Okay, so you have free molecules of glucose in the blood. Okay, now these free molecules of glucose, they will combine with the oxygen which is there in your blood, and this will result in free radical damage and oxidative damage, okay, which is called as oxidative stress. All right, so this is what happens. You have these free glucose molecules in the blood, excessive amount of it. Okay, this is not a healthy amount. This much amount should not be there in your blood. But when you have large amounts of these glucose molecules just randomly floating in your blood, they will react with oxygen in your blood, and this will result in free radical damage, which is called as oxidative stress. Okay, that is one thing. The second thing, what will happen, this excessive amount of glucose which is there in your blood, this will start combining with amino acid molecules and fatty acid molecules. Okay, now glucose combining with protein or fat molecules, this is called as advanced glycation end products, AGES. Some of the students ask me, is it okay to just write AGES in your exams? No. Okay, you need to write the exact terminology. All right, so as I said, this unit is heavily intertwined with biochemistry. You need to remember these terminologies, because if you are planning to practice as health professionals, and this is a health unit subject, it is not an art subject, all right, or not a commerce subject, then yes, there are certain terminologies that you will need to remember. So yes, advanced glycation end products. Okay, then what happens? Then when you have these free radical species which are floating in your blood, okay, they will cause genetic, this will cause altered gene expression. Okay, because free radical damage, guys, oxidative stress has the ability to increase inflammation in its own capacity. So when you have free radical molecules in your blood, this in itself will trigger the immune system and it will increase inflammation. Free radical damage, okay, or you have free radical ions in your body, they in itself are inflammatory agents. Okay, so they will trigger the immune system, but they themselves are inflammatory agents. And because they themselves are inflammatory agents, they then can alter your gene expression, meaning your WBC, RBCs, okay, the basics of your WBC, RBC, DNA, RNA, nucleus. So all of those the main fundamentals of your body, this will be genetically altered. Okay, so remember, free radical damage, it has the capacity to not only trigger your immune system, which can release inflammatory products, but they are inflammatory agents in itself. Okay, then, so guys, these remember, when you have lots and lots amount of glucose in the blood, high blood sugar level, and if the diabetic individual is say exposed to any sort of cuts and wounds, which say on their fingertips, on their toes, this excessive amount of glucose in the blood, when it is exposed to the natural environment, okay, which has a lot of bacteria and other sort of pathogens and things, this can lead to sepsis, and sepsis can lead to gangrene, which is, you have further gangrene is say lot of sepsis. Okay, and if this is not amputated or treated in time, this can lead to systemic sepsis, meaning all those sepsis, they are going into your blood, in very simple layman terms, and this can result in death as well. Okay, so sepsis is when you have bacterial inflammation, pus, you know, in simple terms, when you have an acne, and if you say poke that acne, then it develops into that yellow dirty mucousy thing, that is pus. That is basically bacterial inflammation, and that happened because the bacteria in the environment, they entered into the skin and they started growing, the bacterial body started growing. Okay, so similarly, when you have a lot of glucose in the blood and the wound is exposed to the environment, the bacteria, they love this lots of glucose in the blood. That's food to them. So they start eating all that glucose, they start growing, multiplying, causing sepsis, pus, and excessive amount of that is called as gangrene, which then needs to be amputated. Okay, so this is what I said, gangrene if wound is infected. All right, so if they do have cuts and wounds. That's why regulation of blood sugar level is so important, because high blood sugar level, high risk of bacterial contamination, infection, high risk of gangrene, and gangrene, if not treated well, can lead to amputation. Okay, amputation basically cutting off of that finger and things, because you don't want that sepsis to be traveling in your blood and then infecting the whole body. Okay. So yes, guys, at the end, what is the basic conclusion of this? You have free radical ions. They are inflammatory agents in itself. Advanced glycation end products are also inflammatory agents in itself. All right. And when you have lots of advanced glycation end products in your blood, when you have a lot of free radical ions which are floating in your blood, this automatically will trigger your immune system. So at the end, you have systemic inflammation in your body. Okay. So meaning you have a lot of inflammatory molecules which are there in your body, in your blood. When you say systemic, it means blood. And blood goes everywhere in your body. And that's why it is systemic. It is not local. It is not specific. It is systemic. Okay. So yes, now when you have a lot of inflammatory blood, which is flowing everywhere in your body, this inflammatory blood will go to all of your various organs. Okay. So now let's see how the organal system is being affected. Okay, so you have systemic blood, which is entering your gastrointestinal tract, okay, your GI tract. When it enters your GI tract, when inflammatory blood with inflammatory compounds such as advanced glycation end products, oxidative free radical damaged ions, and you have automatically cytokines, all right, and the cytokines meaning your interleukin 1, 2, tumor necrosis factor. When all of these sort of molecules, they enter into your GI system, they trigger the production of lipopolysaccharides, LPS. Now these lipopolysaccharides, again, they are inflammatory products in itself. Okay. So you see how one inflammatory product is triggering the production of another inflammatory product. So yes, lipopolysaccharide is an inflammatory product in itself. And this again will result into inflammation. Okay. So now when you have this inflammatory molecule, systemic inflammation, happening in your brain, hypothalamus, then what happens? Then you have leptin resistance. You remember in obesity, I said one of the reasons for leptin resistance is increased systemic inflammation. And now you see how, okay? So yes, you have high systemic inflammation. This will result in leptin resistance, okay? And when you have leptin resistance, it means your body cannot see that there is a lot of leptin in the blood, meaning I should tell the individuals to stop eating. No, you may keep on eating, and this will result in high caloric intake. And if this is compounded with low energy expenditure, this will increase the risk of obesity. Okay. So you saw that how when you have systemic inflammation, this results in leptin resistance, and leptin resistance, as you know, can trigger obesity. Okay. Then when you have the systemic inflammation in your liver, what does this do? Liver is your main site for glucose metabolism. Okay. Like your TCA, glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, all of that. The main site for glucose metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, is your liver. All right. When you have systemic inflammation, this will impair the functioning of glucose metabolism. All right. The efficiency with which you have glucose metabolized in your body, meaning glucose used for energy, glucose stored as glycogen, gluconeogenesis happening, meaning fat and protein taken for the production of glucose. All of these cycles, they will be impaired at the baseline level, at a fundamental level. Okay. And why? Because you have inflammatory compounds which are entering the liver. So the liver functioning is compromised. Remember, whenever you have inflammatory blood, meaning systemic inflammation in any of your organs, the basic functioning of that organ will start being compromised. All right. So yes, when you have glucose metabolism which is impaired, what does this happen? This will trigger insulin resistance, because you don't have the efficient conversion of glucose into glycogen, or glucose into energy, things like that. All right. So this will trigger insulin resistance. Okay. Impaired glucose metabolism is equal to high insulin resistance. Okay. Similarly, when you have impaired leptin, impaired, so you have, when you have leptin resistance, you have obesity. Okay, high risk of obesity. So now at the end, again over here, inflammation will result in insulin resistance. You have obesity. Now obesity is a sublime condition of chronic inflammation, and you know how obesity can result in inflammation in itself, and how obesity can cause insulin resistance. These three boxes: obesity, inflammation, insulin resistance. And this is your type 1 and type 2, the mechanism 1 and 2, which we covered in the PowerPoint slide. Okay. So all of this, and this is your mechanism 1 and 2 in the PowerPoint slide. Okay, so obesity causing type 2 diabetes is what we have covered. Now you know when you have sublime inflammation, this results in insulin resistance. Glucose metabolism impaired, automatically you have insulin resistance. And when you have insulin resistance in total, this causes type 2 diabetes. Okay, so this is how you have insulin resistance, which results in obesity, and obesity in turn can cause type 2 diabetes, and insulin resistance can further is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Okay, so you see it's a vicious circle, and which is what I have summarized over here. I'll just share the screen with you again. All right, so just bear with me. So now over here, in summary, this is a vicious circle. In the mechanism 1 and 2, we saw how obesity causes inflammation, and inflammation results in insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes. In the Word document, we saw how insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes causes systemic inflammation, and systemic inflammation can result in obesity. Okay, so this is your vicious circle.